Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Sandman, Season 1, Episodes 9 and 10. So first, let's go on and, rebuttal and correct myself from other episodes, and then let's also talk about the season as a whole, kind of talk about the little pieces that end up going on within these last episodes, and then going into spoilers also. So, the one correction, evidently the monstrous-looking character that was talking to Barbie in her dream sequence was Martin Tenbones. Evidently the character reappears again, and they end up saying this person's name, and I'm like, okay, that's what the character's name was, as if it really mattered, because there's a ton of characters that they just kind of plop in here, and I'm just kind of like, okay, what was the point of that character? None? Okay, great. There wasn't a point to that character. Great. But also pushing on. Carl. Carl had made a mistake and mentioned, I think, in some part of one of the reviews. I assumed that Carl was to get killed off screen by the Corinthian because you would have thought that the Corinthian would have killed the person, but I guess not. So he's even gone on and done less than what I thought he had done in this show. But the way of which that they kind of wrap up things, the Corinthian is to go on and again get his hands dirty and have this really interesting speech that I thought was really cool. So Carl, of course, was to, by the end of this episode, be at Rose's house, going on and kissing with Hal. And there's that for you. So I could have easily gone on and been like a writer's mind here and could have written into the fact that within my brain to say that the Corinthian is to be a nightmare, which means that he's not a real person in the real world. So anyone that the Corinthian was to go on and kill, the Sandman could have honestly easily snapped and made all those people that the Corinthian was to go on and kill. He could have resurrected all of them, and because the Corinthian isn't a real thing anyways, that could go on and just save my hide from making that mistake. But either way, it doesn't really matter. Carl is sadly not an important character to the finishing up of this show. It's not vital that I need to know whether he's alive or not, but it is what it is. And pushing on. So, now that I've possibly made those mistakes, I'm sure there's more of which that I said or did or whatever. Lyda, I couldn't figure out the pronunciation of her name because by then it didn't really seem that that character had much importance, but it seems that the more and more we go on to the show, it seems that she actually has a story going on that I could really sink my teeth into, and so on and so forth. But again, even by the end of this show, the show is still being carried by Rose Walker, and I'm like, okay, I get it, this character, seemed important, but man, are they really just, still, we don't even have the Sandman really here by the end of this show, and I'm like, so for your title screen character has to have his story carried by everyone else. And then he just comes in when things have gone too far and just snaps it all away to just be like, okay, well, I've corrected that now. And that feels like a very deflating kind of story, to where by the end of this season, there have been so many characters they just added into this show to eventually have me ask, it's like, okay, what was the point of that character? Oh, there was no point? Great. I was like, what was the whole thing about despair about? Nothing? Great. What was the whole point of Gilbert? Or Fiddler's Green, let me correct myself for me incorrectly saying that person's name from before. What was the point of Fiddler's Green besides him going on and driving Rose to that one convention. Let's also get that correct as well. The get together that we end up finding that a bunch of serial murderers are to all be put into, because like, okay, what are they talking about here? This conference, this thing, like, what does this mean? When I was hearing this dialogue before between Funland and the Good Doctor and Nimrod, I was like, what are they planning? What is really going on? And come to find out, it's just some convention like Comic-Con, as they kind of make the joke, that these characters are all going to, because they're all serial killers, and they're going to go on and tell their story. Which really they don't go on and say much. They're just kind of saying like, well, like, because like we're this kind of theme, that we have to go on and say that, like, well, yeah, we are these characters, and that's who we are, and like that's all the convention really is. Or it's kind of giving this motivational speech at some point to a number of people, and I'm like, okay. Like, wow, I thought that there was to be something more interesting going on here, but again, it is what it is with the show. So, I would say that this show mostly has to rest on visuals, and that will probably appeal people more so than every single episode. I think coming off of this, like, I think certain episodes will probably interest people rather than this show as a whole. So I think that's probably the weakest part about this show, is the fact that it's not overall interesting. It's just like, okay, pick and choose whatever you're gonna really get out of this. And so I can understand why, like, this show isn't as strong, or is to be like the flagship thing as like a Witcher is, or like any other kind of thing that is to be smashing its way through Netflix right now, because you really have to go on and not only, one, know that this character is a comic book character, probably have read the book before you even went on here, and are to go on and have cared enough to want to see versions of other shows and characters that are not going to be as well presented within the show as it was in other mediums, continually, as I am to go on and say. Like, it also feels like already they've tried to use more successful things to try to resell you on the show, and that sounds really bad. And it's like, man, you have to go on, you have to, like, take the Netflix show, or take the show Lucifer, to try to sell the Sandman onto people, and that just feels so weird, to try and do that retroactively. But anyways, so how does this story come out? Kind of like it almost did in previous episodes. It's really just the same story, like 2 episodes ago, just replayed again, but now there has to be just like, well, hey, we have to like wrap this up. It has to go somewhere. The only thing that I think is to be the most interesting thing coming out towards the end of this is the serial convention, and that's about it. There's some visual things going on in the dream world, I'll admit that, but everything else is to just be really tied to that serial convention. And that's just kind of like, man, that's pretty sad. Like, there isn't finally a battle between characters. No, it's just snap fingers, have this guy go away again for the Sandman, and then eventually by the end of this show, we go on to have Lucifer, who is to state claim that she's going to go on and finally do what she has never done before, because of... Were we thinking that she was going to go with the same plan that she's always had, just like try to take over the world, like as if she's Pinky in the Brain and she's gonna just have the same exact strategy. No. Um, but I even thought it was kind of goofy that when Sandman was to finally confront uh, Desire here, like it just feels like Sandman was to put the fear in God in her, or Desire, and really that just felt like, man, did that just go really limp. Just you just go in and just be like, hey, like, I don't like what you did, but there's nothing I can do, so see you later, bye. What? So we go on and we have Rose. Rose is to still be the Vortex, and it seems that the Vortex is to go on and create problems within the dream world, to the point of us having this climax of now Dream is to have to go on and finally resolve the Vortex, because what she is doing is not right. And so, to the point of there being cracks in the dream world now, and we have Mark Hamill, Marv, Pumpkinhead, who of course is going on here and is to tell us that it's like, oh well, like these cracks are happening, like Sandman, maybe you should go on and do something about this, because Sandman honestly is a lazy piece of he really honestly does nothing, and then has like Lucienne do all like the heavy lifting in the dream realm, but then the Sandman just kind of takes all the credit for it. Like, that's what it really comes down to, and that's what it feels by the end of this show, that the Sandman can't even go on and investigate what is going on in his dream world. He just goes on to Lucienne and asks her, it's like, hey, what's going on in the dream world? Because I was just sitting on my couch just eating chips all day. Hey, what were you doing? Were you the one actually going to go on and investigate what's going on while I was going to sit here and do nothing? Honestly, just the Sandman like needs to prove to me in the second season that he can legitimately go on and do a thing within the show. Because I'm not impressed by the end of the way that this thing is to resolve. So, with that said, let's go on into the real spoilers of this, because I talked far too long. I know I really didn't go into tee-ups, but I kind of like said some things that ended up happening here, because really the exact same story is still going on. There isn't much different than me just going on and saying, yeah, like, Rose is still looking for Jed, that's still a story, and eventually it'll come to the conclusion when they go to this convention, and eventually we have the Sandman, who is to make his way to this convention also, to try and not only protect the Vortex from possibly getting killed, but then is to try and find the Corinthian. And also, like, there was a cool spot where the Sandman is to turn to all the other people that are in this this convention also, to really go on and scare them in a way of which that makes them all realize the mistakes that they all have made. And so in the last episode, in the finishing up of it all, we have Rose, who is to go on and become an author of a story, I think, called Into the Light. And eventually we have Unity, who is to play a bigger role than we naturally assumed from before. And we also are to go on and have Lyda here, who is to also have a bigger story by the tail end of this show. So, with that said, let's just go on into spoilers so I can get this out of the way, because there's a lot to say, of course. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. So, we of course go on to have Rose, who is to find out that both of Jed's parents had been killed off. So, Corinthian is to go on and not kill Carl, but he goes on and kills Jed's parents, because why not? So, because I guess they were bad people, right? And Carl doesn't seem like a bad person. I don't know. Let's rationalize it consistently. So, Rose is to go on and tell this story to Lyda, who, come to find out, is to have her own tale to tell us. Lyda, of course, we find out, is actually pregnant by a dream. By Hector. Maybe, no wait. So, come to find out also, we find that same thing has gone on to happen to another person in Rose's life, who is to actually be Rose's great grandmother. Let's get that correct also. And so we have Unity that, come to find out, had mentioned before that she had fell in love with a person with gold eyes, and we didn't know what that meant. And now by the end of this, when she is to go on and say this tale again, we have the Sandman who is to immediately figure out who that is, but still it doesn't feel like any of that grew to any much more importance than where it was episodes ago. Anyways, so the Sandman is to, of course, go on into the dream world and find out that there are earthquakes happening and cracks upon the dream realm that he has to go on and try to fix, because Merv is to go on and meet with Dream to tell him that this is happening, and Dream is to go on and ask Lucienne about it, and the only conclusion that they can make is like, well, what is new within the dream world? Well, the vortex. Well, then that has to be the answer of the cracks is the new latest thing within the dream world, has to be the one causing all these problems. So eventually the Sandman is to make his way to Lyda and Hector's home to go on and find Rose, Lyda, and Hector all in this place together. And we go on to have the Sandman, of course, realizing that Hector has to actually be dead. That him being in the dream world is not the right place for him to be. And so the Sandman is to have to go on and snap his fingers and resolve this character. And Hector is to, of course, trying to hold on to Lyda. Lyda is to say that she can't let him go. And so the Sandman snaps fingers, does away with Hector. And now we, of course, have Lyda, who is all upset. And the Vortex is now to kind of step in to eventually tell the Sandman, it's like, well, hey, like not only the Sandman, like, yeah, you probably own this place, like, your name's on the door and whatever, but, like, I own a part of this too. Like, I'm also in control of this world as well, and so I'm finally going to put my foot down and say that, that, yeah, you may live here, but, or you may be here, you may live here and whatever, but I live here also, and I have as much power almost as you do. And so, because Dream is to go on and want to snap his fingers again to take away Lyda's baby, and that is when, of course, Rose steps in and says, like, no, you can't do that. You can't go on and do that, because now Rose is to establish dominance and establish her control. So that will mean that the Sandman is to now to want to snap his fingers and do away with the vortex because she is conflicting with him. And so the Sandman is like, "Well, I'll come for you. Like I'm gonna come for you and and get rid of you. That's okay with me." So we go on to then have Rose wake up realizing that now she's on borrowed time. And so now she, of course, wants to go on and find her brother. So we have the Corinthian and we have Jed that are going on and eating ice cream. And we consistently see that Jed is to always be hungry, to the point of when they go to the cereal convention, Jed thought that there would actually be legitimately cereal there. And we have the Corinthian that is asking Jed, it's like, "You're still hungry? Like, we just had ice cream, like, X number of minutes ago, within the part of this episode." So, we have the Corinthian that wants to go on and reunite Rose with Jed, and is to eventually say that the Corinthian does not know Rose, but he had saw this flyer, and so the Corinthian goes on and calls Rose, and is to say that she will eventually go on to have her brother reunite with her, and all they need to do is kind of go to this location to be able to make it so. So, since Lyda, of course, is pregnant, we instead have Gilbert, who is to go on with Rose to make her road trip to make it to this location that the Corinthian is to be at. So Gilbert is going on and being in this car and boring Rose to death. Because this guy is the Fiddler's Green and he's boring, to the point of him having no real good usefulness in the show, besides him finally going back to the Dream Realm and telling the Sandman, like, "Hey, what's what?" So, but the Fiddler's Green is to go on and mention about all these things that eventually quickly send Rose off to sleep because this guy's boring anyways. And so eventually that's when Rose goes on to eventually be with Lyda and Hector, and all that event plays out. So eventually when Rose wakes up, makes her way to this convention, we have the Corinthian who takes Jed and puts him in this room, and he's eating like chicken fingers and he's watching Static Shock again. I think this is in the later parts of Static Shock when eventually they just needed him to consistently go on and have team-ups. That's when you start to see that Static Shock is wearing the black outfit and he's teaming up with Superman in whatever episode that is to be Static Shock. Cause I remember Static Shock eventually teams up with like Batman when they had like Batman and Robin, or the Adventures of Batman and Robin, like some point when Batman had like the black and gray costume, and so whatever was kind of still like out there to be an animated series, Static Shock was to start to team up with, because they started running out of stories for this character later down the road, to just try to continue to tie him into things. But eventually, in the Justice League episode, when we go on and we tie in characters like Batman Beyond, they also have a much older Static Shock within that episode. And I think also they tie in Static Shock to like Justice League 3000 and all these kind of future things, and like they have him as a older Static Shock, and I think that's cool. So I don't know why they're selling Static Shock so hard in this show, but it is what it is, to, I guess, tell you what's coming later. Maybe Netflix is going on and doing a Static Shock thing, because maybe somehow, like, Warner Brothers is kind of dipping into instead of having HBO Max stuff, maybe Warner Brothers again is just going to be relying on Netflix to sell all their things again. Because from what I've heard, maybe HBO Max may get dissolved. I don't know. But kind of hold on to your subscription for as long as that is, because I don't know what's really going on with Warner Brothers whatsoever. But anyways, so the Corinthian is to tell Jed that he should go on and stay within this room. We also had the Corinthian that was going on and telling Nimrod and the good doctor that Jed is going to be under his protection and no one should go on and harm him, as well as Rose will be under his protection also when she arrives. And he wants everyone to know that. Every single person here, even Funland, who's to be wearing this goofy hat. So, because Jed had gone on to talk to Funland, and we have a moment where the Corinthian is to... I almost want to call the Corinthian the Carpathian, because of course I know Vigo the Carpathian. This College of Adelphia commands you. And whatever goofy line that was. So, the Corinthian. We go on and have him try to tell Funland, hey, like, this one's mine. Like, I stake claim to this one. So, Funland's like, oh, okay, all right. So, but we have the Corinthian that goes into one of these conferences, and we have Nimrod who is mentioning that they have a guest speaker here, and the Corinthian ends up standing up and sitting down. And I'm like, why couldn't the Corinthian just go on and do the speech that he was doing right then and there? There could have been multiple times where he could have said the same speech over and over and over again to a number of people. Because I've seen that a number of times where you have like a number of different panels and things like that, where I'm sure these people have said these stories up-teen tillion times, and because eventually people go on and always ask the exact same questions also in a number of panels. It's not ever really unique enough. Like the Power Rangers always get asked, like, hey, what's your favorite color? Like, if you weren't to be XYZ Ranger, which Ranger would you be? There's always those kind of same questions. There's never anything that is ever unique, because a lot of people, like, never had heard this answer before. And, like, there is a huge amount of limited creativity when you're going on and coming up there and wanting to ask somebody a question that really sounds good, that they really want to go on and answer, instead of just being like, oh, I don't know. And then that's the answer of that. So anyways. But if they can go on and try to figure out an answer, they will, even if it doesn't work within their wheelhouse. Like CM Punk having to go on and talk about jazz, and figure out a way to work that into an after match kind of interview, which he ends up figuring it out, and I thought that was very intelligent of him, if not always, to think of that anyways. So we go on, and we, after that whole, like, him standing up, him sitting down, going back to eventually be with Jed, as Jed is kind of going on, and instead of wanting to just stay in the room like he should, once the Corinthian goes on to kind of commingle with a bunch of these serial killers, and we go on to have one guy who is kind of looking back at Corinthian consistently compared to everyone else, we come to find out that that guy is none other than the Boogeyman. And I'm like, oh my god, the Boogeyman! Like, in my brain, I always imagined that there's actually a Boogeyman story where you can go on and say that the Boogeyman is actually the hero of a story, and, like, people don't realize it. He's gotten a bad rap for so long. He's actually a good person, but people don't understand. You can kind of write him off as like a villain or a Venom looking character, and like he would be kind of really interesting to kind of see how that plays out as like the boogeyman being a hero of a story. Um, but anyways, there's my 2 cents about that. So, but the boogeyman is here, and he is to go on and looks like some normal Joe Schmo guy. And so, come to find out, this guy is actually not the boogeyman after all. It's to actually be another guy who, of course, probably isn't actually listed in here because, of course, not. Or I probably can't find him that easily. So they end up saying what his real name is by the other episode. I think the last episode, because we have the Corinthian who is going to Nimrod, and of course the good doctor, and mentioning that the boogeyman had died 3 years ago and had died via this drowning incident. And they're asking, it's like, well, hey, are you sure about that? And we go on, and we have the Corinthian that is telling him, I am absolutely sure. Like I am correct on this assumption, and please do not go on and assume otherwise. So we go on to eventually have a name that is still not into IMDb anywhere. Isn't that freaking great? I couldn't find it anywhere, so that's great. Let me go on and pause here. Maybe I'll find it. Philip Sitz. Philip Sitz is the vlogger, or the blogger's name. Weirdly enough, we have the guy who is to be putting together a blog about this whole serial killer thing. It is to have his face slapped right on it with his name next to it. And what a mistake that was. So, come to find also, from what I had learned, the main reason why the boogeyman had gone on to be dead for 3 years is because supposedly in a Swamp Thing story, the Swamp Thing had gone on and faced the boogeyman, and the Swamp Thing had taken him out. So there's a whole thing because of rights to try to figure out a way to not have the boogeyman actually in the story. So that's how they kind of went about doing it. So there's legitimate proof within the comic books that I guess the Swamp Thing had tied himself to the boogeyman. So that's how they kind of try to figure a way to have like the DC world being tied comic book wise. And I think that's kind of cool. To eventually see the comic book attachment to a story is really just kind of fascinating or interesting. So you can go and see the tale of that Swamp Thing story within the Swamp Thing books, if you probably Google it. So we have an imposter at this convention. So we also go on to have Rose at one point talking to Unity. And Rose, since Jed's foster parents are now killed, Rose is to try to call Unity to try to figure out how Jed can be now Rose's legal guardian, or Unity to go on and be Jed's and Rose's legal guardian. Of course, now that they have no real parents besides Rose having Lyda as her guardian, and so on and so forth. So, but anyways, we cover that now, and we of course have Holloway, who is to kind of put that together for Unity. So now back at the convention. So the Corinthian is to understand that this guy is not who the boogeyman is. And so the Corinthian is now to go on and tell Nimrod and the good doctor that we need to go on and eliminate this guy. But we had Nimrod mentioning that he tells everybody to don't crap where you eat, so no one go on and kill anybody, uh, or trying to be within 200 miles away from this convention if you're going to do so. And so the Corinthian is to tell that to Nimrod himself about, like, well, wait, what about your rule? And they're to go on and say, it's like, well, since you're our guest of honor, I think we can give you some leniency. And if you go after this guy, I think we can kind of let that slide. And the Corinthian is to go on and say, it's like, well, how about instead of just me going after this, how about me, Nimrod, and the good doctor going after him all together, to even make this much more interesting. So we have Rose, who is to finally go on to make it to this convention with Gilbert. And so we go on, of course, to have them not know what this convention is. They just know that it's a serial convention. And we have Rose and Gilbert trying to find out information about this convention, and Funland is trying to prevent them from finding out anything. But Rose, while Funland is talking to Gilbert, snatches some certain name tags, and so it seems that Gilbert is to be the Dutch uncle and Rose is to be the babysitter, because Nimrod is to tell everybody to stick with their code names and, like, don't tell anybody who you really are, or you'll give up the fact that you, of course. Plus, here's my thing: how are they going to go on and prove that they are any of these people? They could just go on and say, "Oh yeah, I'm that guy," and then let's arrest him. I said let's arrest him. So what ends up happening here is Rose is to find out that she already has a room. As once Gilbert is to find out that this is to be this convention, this serial killer convention, as he's going on through every one of these panels and realizing we have, like, the Hammer of God telling people how he's to do his work, and we have a number of these, like, female killers that are to go on and say, it's like, well, hey, like, don't look at our gender and think that we can't go on and do this too, kind of thing. And like, it all becomes about, like, the feminist movement within serial killers within this dialogue. And I'm like, okay, like, hey, like, however you go on and you have your panel is however you go on and you have your panel. So yeah, we just have Gilbert that is just baffled by this whole thing, till eventually, finally, Gilbert is to notice that the Corinthian is here. And so Gilbert has to quickly leave, and so he leaves a message for Rose at this place saying that he had to go and leave because he was to go back to the dream world, where he was to meet with Lucian and the Sandman and tell them, hey, like, Rose is at this hotel, this convention, and eventually something is going to go horribly wrong here. And we had the Sandman who's to tell the Fiddler's Green, like, how could you have left this dream world? Like, you were the heart of this place. And Fiddler's Green was like, no, like, you were the heart of this place. Like, I was just here, so that's why I left. So we go on to have the Fiddler's Green think that he's going to get some punishment for him leaving, and the Sandman is like, no, I don't have it in me to punish you, Fiddler's Green. Even when the Fiddler's Green is to probably sacrifice himself, which we'll get to later. So we go on to have the Sandman that is to make his way to this convention and eventually go on to find that Corinthian had given both Rose and Jed this room for them to stay in. And he's to even give them all the keys to the room and tell them, hey, like, I'm gonna leave for an hour. You guys can stay here. I'm gonna go and do a thing, and when I come back, you can let me in. You can not let me in. Like, that's your own prerogative. Like, that's fine. But the Corinthian is to also go on and say that he is to have saved their lives, even though Jed was to go on and see the Corinthian go and kill Philip with Nimrod and the good doctor, and so Jed was to run away from them. But then when we go on to have Jed, who is to be taken by Funland, and Rose is to go on and try and meet up with Jed finally to just be like, Jed, is that you? And then they have this hug and embrace, and then all of a sudden Funland's there. I'm here. And so we have the Corinthian who ends up killing Funland so he can protect both Rose and Jed from certain death. And then he puts them in this room, and then it's to tell them I'll be gone for an hour, as he is to go on and be the guest of honor, because the family man was, of course, to have gone on and been tied to a John Constantine book, which actually is to have been called Hellraiser, where I guess Constantine had gone on to defeat the family man in some story, so you guys can go and check that out, and Google that and find that whole story, or eventually go on to check that whole thing out. So that's why they wrote him off of this story. So I'm like, oh my god, this is so awesome to have these comic book ties. That eventually I went on to figure out the backstory of all this. This is so cool. I love the referencing of this. I love this about this story. Now that I just realized that, okay, there was actually some importance of these characters in other books that I wasn't aware of. But I know that John Constantine and Swamp Thing exists. Like, we go on and we have them being tied at some point to Animal Man, because of the red and the green and the whole rot thing. I don't know how that story like finished up, because I really started to read a hefty amount of Animal Man, but I never knew how the story concluded because I eventually just started to run out of ability to continue to buy books to figure out how that all resolved. So that is what it is. Plus, also, I think I would have had to have probably needed to get the Swamp Thing part of story also, and I would have to have read that from like start to finish. And I'm like, oh man, there's too many stories to have to read. When eventually you're just like, oh, there's only two. Anyways, so because I would have had to start from scratch from the new Swamp Thing, and I was like, I don't know, the new Swamp Thing was all that good during that time. But anyways, so we have the Sandman that is to meet up with the Corinthian, who is making this whole speech about like kind of giving these guys this motivational thing, that they should all kind of close their eyes and just imagine that they are as great as they are, and so on and so forth. And the Sandman is to go on and eventually interrupt this by going on and wanting to defeat the Corinthian, by realizing that also the Corinthian and a number of these people are also in the dream world, and that Rose and Jet are also in the dream world, and Rose and Jet are possibly going to get killed in the dream world by a number of these killers that are all connected into the one same dream, and the Corinthian had orchestrated all this. Which I thought was like the coolest scene in this entire series, where we all of a sudden have all of these killers that are all in this one connected dream, and we start to see like the good doctor, who is starting to pluck out every organ because that's what she specializes in. And I guess we have Nimrod, who is to be sewing up skin because that's what he goes on and does, as well as the Corinthian, who is to mention that his thing is to go on and pluck out the eyes. So we have now having the Sandman need to save Rose within her dream, and we of course have the Sandman, who is to force Rose and Jed to wake up, so that way the Sandman could go after the Corinthian without the worry of Rose, of course, being in danger. So the Sandman goes on and snaps his fingers and eventually completely wipes out the Corinthian, and all that is left is to be this skull. And so we're either assuming one of many things: that this could lead to this Corinthian being resurrected, that this could lead to the Sandman going and reinventing this character in a different way. Any number of things could possibly happen. I'm thinking the whole resurrection route, that eventually this character will be re-put back together and will be on the villain side of things, and that's how they'll kind of have this character continue on with the story. So the Sandman goes on to now have to have his conflict resolved with the Vortex now that he has gone on and finished up with Rose here. And we have the Sandman, who is to turn to all these serial killers and tell them that they all need to now feel the guilt and the sadness and the sorrow and the remorse of all the people that they have ever killed, and so on and so forth, forcing them all to then go back into their cars and either shoot themselves, call the police to tell them that they have done these crimes, or go on and try to do any number of things, while Rose, of course, is to make her way back into this car to drive and try to escape out of here. To eventually lead us to having the Sandman and Rose having a conversation with one another to resolve their conflict. And what ends up actually happening is Unity is to also be in the dream realm also. So Unity is to go on and talk to Lucienne to ask her, it's like, hey, where is the whole story of my life? Like, I need to go on and find it. And Lucienne is like, I don't know if we have that book. And Unity's like, well, I think you do somewhere. We also had a moment where Matthew was talking to Lucienne, trying to convince her that she is much more than a librarian, and she's a big part of the dream realm. And Lucien's like, no, I'm just a librarian, like, I'm just gonna go on and just, like, have the Sandman go on and do what he does, and I'll just be here and just be a librarian. That's fine with me. And Matthew is trying to be like, no, come on. And Lucien's like, no, I'm just gonna be here, just be a librarian, that's fine. And the Sandman is to have to go on, and eventually when he's kind of trying to figure out what is going on with this dream realm, he also apologizes to Lucien and is to realize that Lucien does have more responsibilities within this dream world than the Sandman is willing to admit. And Gilbert is to go on and tell Lucien, it's like, wow, the Sandman has really changed since the time of him being in the real world. And, like, obviously, him going on and apologizing to Lucien is to be, like, a big thing. And that maybe Lucien doesn't know how big that really was. And that, even more so, the Fiddler's Green is to be, like, so, like, excited about being in the dream world now that it seems that the Sandman is to go on and be a different person. It's kind of like, of course, when we have eventually in the later X-Men movies, I know I'm tying in a Marvel thing, but we have a moment where, like, Jean Grey turns to Wolverine and say that, like, he's tamed you, Wolverine, like, Xavier has tamed you. And that's what I'm kind of feeling like happened with Sandman here, is that he is to go on and instead of just snapping everything away all the time, just doing away with it, instead, like, he's realized, like, well, maybe I shouldn't go on and just kill off everything and just say that I have to do that because I have the power to. No. Like he's actually trying to go on and like realize if he should go on and do this, if it's the right thing or not. And we start to see that within this story. So we have Dream that is to want to go on and wipe out the vortex, but come to find out Unity is to make her way between these two. And so Unity is to go on and say that since she had the sleep sickness, that actually she was supposed to be the original vortex, but things had happened, and Unity had gone on to sleep with this golden-eyed person to lead her to have the vortex abilities being put into other people instead, put into her descendants. And so the Sandman is going to be like a golden-eyed person. I think I know exactly who you're talking about. And so Unity is to go on and eventually take the responsibility from Rose to become or re-become the vortex for the dream realm. And Unity goes on in the real world and dies in her sleep. So Unity is to now be the vortex, and so now Rose has no power, and then she goes on to wake up and write her own story, Into the Light, where she possibly goes on to tie into probably the Sandman into that whole story. Here's also the thing, one thing that I guess I messed up about. I guess the version of the Sandman that we see Jed wearing within these episodes actually has some reference to another Sandman in other comic books. I didn't realize this, but evidently there is a way of which that the Sandman was to look in other books that looks just like this weird yellow getup and ruby thing and like the hourglass. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I was waiting for the Smallville version, but I guess we didn't get that. Because that's already a thing, as I joke. So we go on into trying to wrap this up here. So Rose is to go back to the real world and become a writer and have her submit this story. And we have Lucien, who is to tell the Sandman that now this story of Rose exists, and so on and so forth. And so the Sandman is to go on and create new dreams and new nightmares, as we see within the thumbnail, that we end up having Galt kind of change her stripes here. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of assumed that's where the story was heading. So we had Galt, who is to change from this nightmare to have Sandman recreate her into this dream where she is to now be this kind of butterfly-ish like character that is flying around and like, ooh, ah. So we go on to have now the Sandman who's like, hey, I'm going to go on and do a lot of work here. So Lucien, you go on and like you just kind of watch over the dream world as I'm working. We also had the Sandman who is to make his way to Destiny's realm and hold on to Destiny's, my bad, Desire, my bad. The Sandman goes off to find Desire, and so Desire is to be within his heart, and so Morpheus is to say that he's going to come through to speak to her, or to speak to Desire, and so the Sandman is to go on to Desire and say that what she had done, or what Desire had done, is to have been like a wrong move on her part, so on and so forth, but there's nothing that Sandman can really do, so his threats are kind of empty, and Desire is to go on and tell Dream, it's like, well, it's so interesting that I got under your skin that way. But again, like, there's nothing that either one of these characters can do to take one another out. So, by the end of this, we also had Lyda, who is to give pregnant, She was to give a pregnant, right? She was to give a pregnant. She was to give a birth. She was to give a birth to a child. And so, come to find out, they weirdly never went on to name this child because we, of course, had Jed, who was talking to the Corinthian and mentioning that if there is ever a time where you had to have a name, it's probably because you were in trouble about something. And so, like, eventually the Corinthian is to mention, like, a number of scenarios where Jed would have been in trouble. So, Jed goes on and is to realize that this kid should never go on and have a name because then they would never go on and get in trouble. So you're basically just going to call this character It for the rest of its life. Hey, you! That's what you're going to have to call him for the rest of their lives. Hey, you! Yeah, that one. If only I could go on and do that with every single cast member. Just be like, yeah, that one did some things. Wasn't that cool? Hey, yeah, the thing that was the stuff, man, was that great, right? People would go on and be like, man, what is he even talking about? I'm like, I don't know. But anyways. So, pushing on, we have Lucifer and we have Mezakine, who, again, I still have to get over, like, that this is not characters that I'm familiar with still. But we didn't have a Constantine by the end of this for me to gripe about that also. So, if anything, like, Desire is almost what Lucifer should have been in a lot of ways. That's, in my brain, what I was thinking, but anyways. Because that would have actually been much more exciting. And again, what was Despair for? Nothing. She did nothing in this show. What a waste that was. So, Lucifer goes on to talk to Mezakine, and Lucifer is going on and mentioning that she's going to go and do something that she's never done before, which is to end a season of a show that is not actually hers. To mention that she's going to go on and, like, try to probably take on God himself, I'm sure. She's going to go on and try to, like, defy everything and go after and try to, I'm sure, like, take the crown of heaven and whatever. I'm sure that's probably her plan, because that was also the plan eventually going into the Lucifer show, that eventually Lucifer was to say, it's like, well, hey, how about, like, we, like, dethrone God and then just have Lucifer become, like, the new God. Wow, that sounds like a good idea. Instead of having to, like, wait and kind of worry when God is going to wipe them out. Instead, Lucifer is like, well, hey, how about we go on and we fight heaven to eventually, like, not have to worry about God coming after us. So, with that said, that technically does wrap up this season. And luckily it didn't take that long, because I thought it was going to take forever. I didn't really bring up the whole dream sequences where Rose was to go on and again be with her B&B buddies, because there's a lot of that being tied in this episode. Rose is again seeing a bunch of dreams where Hal is to go on and mention that his two sides are to now be really connected, that they're going to need one another to be able to live the rest of their life, that we have the Hal side and we have the dancer side of him, and that eventually they just need one another. And Rose is to go on and eventually see Barbie and Ten Bones again, and find that Ken is to be having a dream affair with some other woman that I guess isn't Barbie. Or maybe it's Barbie with brown hair, and Barbie ends up getting offended, and Ken was like, it was only a dream, baby! It was only a dream affair. And so we have all these, like, dreams all mixed together, to the point of all of a sudden they're like, they're swirling to fall to the wayside as if they're going down some dream world toilet, as even Jed, who is wearing his superhero costume, can't go on and save Rose from this swirly that is happening here. And we go on to eventually have Hal after the baby is being delivered, and Hal is to go on to mention that I think it's about time for him to sell his B&B to go on and live with Rose, but he needs to go on and find a buyer, which he's looking at the Spider Twins, Zelda and the other girl, to eventually buy his place. And so we end up seeing Hal going on and locking lips with Carl, and everything is happy-go-lucky within Rose's life. So I think that's about that time to just go on and wrap up this story. And so with that said, I think I've hopefully said everything that I need to have said by talking long enough. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Hopefully I've covered everything. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot about, because at this point, this could quite possibly be the last thing that I ever go on and say about the Sandman, because who knows with Warner Brothers. So yeah, I would love for there to be a season 2, to see if this story continues anywhere. Plus to also see like Neil Gaiman's or Neil, hopefully I'm saying that right, Neil's work continue on via the show. That would be kind of cool through this other medium. Plus, I just want more comic book stuff, so that's easily to be an appealing factor for me, to want to see more comic book stuff come somewhere down the line. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Hopefully there is a Spectre show coming somewhere down the road, because I want a Spectre show. If we have the Sandman here now being put out, that ends up giving me so much hope or faith that there might be a DC comic book Spectre show eventually coming somewhere down the road. I wouldn't want there to be like the Spectre being Hal Jordan, or I'm probably sure a lot of people would go on and be like, yeah, that would be great if they could continue the Arrow show and have Stephen Amell be the Spectre, and then eventually like Stephen Amell becomes the Green Arrow again. No, like, I want the original Spectre thing. I don't want them to continue the whole Stephen Amell thing. That's great and all. I liked that Stephen Amell became the Spectre. But like, I want the original Spectre show, because I think there's a lot of stuff that they can easily adapt and make a great, wonderful show that a lot of people will love. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.